Well, good evening. It's good to be with you, and thank you for the invitation to preach this evening. I'm particularly grateful to Andrew for agreeing that I continue in the series in the book of Joshua, even though it's chapter 2 we're looking at tonight. It's very difficult when you're asked to preach a one-off sermon. You know, you've got the whole Bible to choose from, and you can spend a long time trying to work out what passage to preach. But I've been told Joshua chapter 2, and I'm happy to do that. But let me begin with a confession and an apology. The confession is that I find great difficulty in choosing a sermon title. I never used to bother in the old days. And the apology is for the title that I've chosen tonight. Lessons from a non-essential chapter. Now, let me explain. In the second half of chapter 1, as we saw last week, Joshua commanded the officers of the people to pass through the midst of the camp, and he commanded the people, prepare your provisions, pack your bags, for within 3 days, we're going to pass over this Jordan and go in to take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Chapter 3, which we'll look at next week, begins, then Joshua arose early in the morning, they set out from Shittim, and they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. So it would seem quite logical for chapter 3 to follow chapter 1 immediately, wouldn't it? But instead, we have chapter 2, which isn't really essential for the telling of the story of Israel's entrance into the land, is it? But chapter 2 is here in the Bible, in the God-breathed word. So the writer, under the Lord's direction, must have had some purpose in inserting these details here. What was that, I wonder? There must be lessons to be learned from this chapter. Hence my title, Lessons from a Non-Essential Chapter. It is still the Word of God. I didn't say lessons from a chapter that's irrelevant. It's a chapter that's non-essential to the story. Okay, that's the explanation. I suggest there are three lessons about the Lord. Lessons that would have been a blessing to the people then, perhaps not at the immediate time, except perhaps for the third one, as we'll see. But as they reflected on them later, I'm sure there were things they learned. But lessons that can certainly be a blessing for us today. And the first is this: God is sovereign. And we're looking particularly at verses 1 to 7. Okay, the chapter begins with Joshua sending out 2 men secretly as spies to view the land, especially Jericho, the first place they were to take. Now, you'll remember that 40 years or so earlier, after they had left Egypt and crossed the Red Sea, Moses sent 12 spies to spy out the land. And on their return, the spies reported how rich and fruitful the land was. Everything the Lord has said about the prosperity of the land was true. But 10 of the 12 reported a problem. The people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We can't attack these people. They're much stronger than we are. We're just like grasshoppers in their sight. And they spread a bad report among the people. The 2 other spies, Joshua and Caleb, agreed that the enemies were real, but they affirmed, if the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Their protection is gone because the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. Well, the 10 spies won the argument, and instead of advancing into Canaan as God had planned for them to do, the nation turned tail and spent the next 38 or so years wandering around the wilderness with a sentence of death over every male over 20 years old at the time they left Egypt, with the exception, of course, of Joshua and Caleb. Now, 40 years or so later, Joshua has just said that within 3 days they're to pass over the Jordan and take possession of the land the Lord was giving them. So why did Joshua send the spies now, even though only 2 of them? Why did he do that? I don't think it was because Joshua couldn't remember what the land, or Jericho even, was like. I don't think it was lack of faith on Joshua's part. There's nothing in the text to suggest any criticism of Joshua here. See, as someone has pointed out, there's an important distinction to be drawn between trusting God and presuming how God is going to act. You see, at this point, Joshua had no intimation that the Lord would deliver Jericho by miraculous means. He merely knew that Jericho's capture was going to happen, and it was crucial to their entry into the land. So Joshua is simply employing a known approach to find out information about the region around Jericho and what Israel will face in Jericho. Joshua knew the Lord would go with him in taking the land. He knew he could go forward in confidence, but he couldn't presume that the means by which the Lord would act would be overtly miraculous, as we'll see in the next few weeks. So it was right and proper that he take appropriate steps. See, for us as Christian believers today, we don't show less faith by assuming that the Lord works mainly through natural means rather than through miraculous means. He may well do something miraculous, but it's presumption on our part to assume that he will act that way. So, whilst planning your new work, moving to, I don't know how to say it, Camelon, whatever it is, moving to another part of Falkirk, you're right to trust the promises of God's presence with you and his promise to build his church. But since miracles are by definition somewhat unusual, you don't presume on them as a basis of your work, even though God may grant them to you. You go forward, contributing all you can to the task before you, asking God to bless your contribution, but knowing that, he can indeed do far more abundantly than you ask or think. Of course, looking back, the spies contributed little to the actual taking of Jericho, but their going there proved to be a blessing in other ways, as we'll see. Well, the spies went to Jericho. They came to the house of this prostitute, Rahab. It's clear that it was easier for the spies to be inconspicuous in the house of a prostitute. Strangers were her trade. And surely they would be less likely to draw attention to themselves than they would perhaps in a more respectable part of the city, unfamiliar to visitors. However, that wasn't the case in Jericho, was it? We see from what Rahab says later that the residents of Jericho were well aware of Israel's presence in the region. And so when the city's king was told of the presence of Israelite men in the city, he sent officials to Rahab's house to investigate. Bring out the men who have come to you, for they've come to search out the land. Well, as we read, Rahab had hidden the 2 men. She agrees with the officials that the men had visited her but they'd left before the city gates were shut. Pursue them quickly, and you'll overtake them. And so they left in pursuit, going down towards the Jordan. But they made sure that the gate was shut firmly. So here are the spies, discovered, trapped in the city. So much for spying out Jericho. What help would they be to Joshua? It seems such a waste of time, didn't it? But that's just the beginning of the chapter. There's so much more to come. The lesson for us here in this bit is that God is in charge. God is sovereign, even when it doesn't look like it. I'm sure you've had times in your Christian lives when you've done things sensibly, believing that it was God's will, and everything seemed to go wrong. Have you had that? But then something happens, and you realize that it was the Lord who got you into that seemingly desperate place, simply to show you his will for your life. It was the autumn of 1978. That's a long time ago, but it was the autumn. I was a vet. I was sure the Lord was leading me on to my own practice in the Lake District. Wonderful. I made plans, found the practice I was going to purchase, gave him my notice, started looking for a house to live in Cockermouth. And after that decision, everything went wrong. Everything. And came to the end of November, finished my work in the university, thinking that this was the Lord's will, but nothing seemed to be working out. Beginning to wonder, well, what is the Lord doing in this? Why have we got into this mess? I got a phone call on the Saturday morning. Someone else was going to set up a practice in that very town. I thought, oh no, that's the end of that. We're in a real mess now. The next morning, Sunday morning and evening, in church, both services that Sunday were about preaching and the need for preachers. I could go into a long detail of that. But you know, it was as if I was the only person in church that day, and the Lord was saying to me, I want you to be a preacher. And so that's what happened. The Lord had, in that sense, got me into that mess because he wanted something far better for me to do. God is sovereign. God is in charge. And I think that's the first lesson from this chapter. God is in charge even when things seem to go wrong. Remember that. I think you sang the hymn this morning, God moves in a mysterious way. And he does. But he moves. Remember that. Well, on with the story. Rahab is clearly the main character in this chapter, and it's from her story that we learn the second lesson, and the second lesson is that God is gracious. And we're looking at verses 8 to 21, the main part of the chapter. Now, you thought I'd skip this one, didn't you? There's a lot of discussion in some of the commentaries about whether it was right for Rahab to lie to those Jericho officials. Some have even suggested that Rahab's approach here is quite similar to that of Rachel in convincing her father that his household gods had not gone with Jacob when he left there, even though she had them. It's interesting that James, in his letter, chapter 2, verse 25, James specifically commends Rahab for receiving the men and sending the officials off in another direction. Well, last week Andrew mentioned that Dale Ralph Davis would be quoted several times through this series. Well, here's his quote about Rahab's lies. Okay? This is what he says. Recording this about Rahab, recording this doesn't mean that the biblical writer necessarily approves of Rahab's lie or that he authorizes us to go and do likewise. He neither approves nor disapproves of Rahab's lie. Rather, he ignores it. That is, its ethical implications. And he goes on, of course, Bible readers must always be careful to distinguish between what the Bible reports and what it recommends, between what it records and what it requires. The Bible reports that Jacob had 4 wives. It's hardly encouraging us to do the same. But I suggest that the fact that God here uses a prostitute and a liar shows that he is gracious. That's the first point there. Well, so far in the story, we know that Rahab had acted for the spies, but we don't know why she'd done that. And now the officials have gone off towards the Jordan. She's able to speak to the spies and explains why she acted the way she did. And the basic explanation of her doing this is that she had come to faith in Israel's God, the Lord. That's made very, very clear in the New Testament, where she's included in that heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. So how did she, of all people, come to faith? Well, that's what she says to the spies in her speech to them, which is really her testimony, isn't it? Look at verse 9. She says, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. Now, how does she know that? Well, verse 10. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. So she'd heard what the Lord had done. And notice, not just what he'd done recently, it covers the whole of Israel's story, right back from the Exodus and the Red Sea to their time of killing these 2 Amorite kings. How did she hear? Well, it's not unreasonable to imagine that the word must have circulated around that region. She'd heard of the Lord's power and that forces who resist him were doomed to fail. And because of that, she emphasizes the dread that had fallen on all the inhabitants of the land, not just Jericho. And so they lack the will to resist. She knows. She just knows that God had given them the land. See, the basis of her faith is hearing about the mighty acts of the Lord. And isn't that the normal way of coming to faith today? Faith comes by hearing. Hearing what God has done in Christ. It's not something that we inherit from our parents. It's not something we catch like a virus, like an illness, by coming to church. It's not something we can accumulate by increasing knowledge. Faith isn't a warm, cozy feeling about God. Faith grows, if at all, out of hearing what God has done for his people. And if that's the basis of her faith, she goes on in verse 11 to confess the conviction of her faith. Look at 11. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. Now, look at that. Up till now, Rahab speaks of the Lord your God. But now it's as if she's identifying the Lord as her God. He is God in heaven above. Now, the verse that's printed out on the front of the order of service is from Deuteronomy chapter 4. And that's really the climax of several verses where Moses has been impressing on the people that the Lord alone is God. So if you go back a few pages to Deuteronomy chapter 4, and we'll just read those few verses from verse 33. Here's Moses saying to the people, now before the end of the wilderness wanderings, before they enter the land, did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and make a nation for himself from the midst of another nation by trials, by signs, by wonders, and by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know the Lord is God. There is no other beside him. Out of heaven he let you hear his voice, that he might discipline you. And on earth he let you see his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. And because he loved your fathers and chose their offspring after them, and brought you out of Egypt with his own presence by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than yourselves, to bring you in and give you their land for inheritance, as it is this day, know therefore today, and lay it to your heart, that the Lord is God in heaven above, and on the earth beneath. There is no other. And that last verse there was, if you like, the conclusion Israel was to reach about her God. And look, here's this pagan Canaanite with an Israelite confession on her lips. The Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and the earth beneath. And she could have added, there is no other. That's the real essence or conviction of faith today, isn't it? God, who has done great things for us, is God in heaven above and the earth beneath. There is no other. He's the only God. Jesus is Lord. And then Rahab goes on, verse 12. And now then, please swear to me by the Lord that if I have dealt kindly with you, and also you also will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. What's she doing? She's giving evidence of her faith. You see, genuine faith never rests content with being amazed and moved by the power of God and convinced of the reality of God, that he's the only God. But it presses on to take refuge in that God. Rahab not only must know the clear truth about God, but she must also escape the coming wrath of God. See, it isn't just a matter of correct belief, but of desperate need. You know, saving faith is always like that. It doesn't stop with, brooding over the activity or nature of God, but it runs to take refuge under his wings. And that was no small thing for Rahab, was it? Think what it meant for her. Leaving the city, leaving the people she knew so well, joining a people that she'd only heard about and was in some ways terrified of. Well, the spies agree to deal kindly with her and allow her to join with the people of God on condition that she doesn't tell about their visit. And then Rahab goes on to give further evidence of her faith. First, by letting the spies down by a rope from her window and telling them to go into the hills, the opposite direction from the Jordan, and hide for 3 days before returning back to the Jordan from where they'd come. And then secondly, by tying this scarlet cord in the window and gathering her family in the house when they return. I don't want to make too much of that scarlet cord, but it may well have reminded the Israelites and Rahab, when she's told the story, of their own salvation in Egypt, when the blood of the Lamb was placed on the doorposts of their homes. Remember? Preserving them from the angel of death who passed over on that awful night when the firstborn sons in Egypt were put to death. As their salvation had been secured by a scarlet strip of blood, so now that of Rahab and her family was secured by a scarlet cord. Rahab clearly wants to be part of the people of God. And again, that's a mark of true saving faith. We want to be part of the Lord's people. Now, can you see why I'm saying that the lesson here is about the graciousness, the grace of God? What but the grace of God could create such faith in the heart of a pagan prostitute, causing her to hear of the mighty deeds of the Lord, bringing her to acknowledge him as the only true God and her God, giving her that desire to belong to the people of God and to work that out in these practical ways. And that's not the end of the story of Rahab, you know. In chapter 6, we read in verse 25, "But Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she has lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho." And that's not the end either, because Rahab gets a mention in just the 5th verse of the New Testament, in that genealogy, as the wife of Salmon and mother of Boaz and the ancestor of King David, who was, of course, an ancestor of our Lord. She's in the family line of Jesus. What amazing grace, isn't it? In choosing Rahab to be part of his purposes in preserving the spies, in bringing her to saving faith, in using her in the family line that led to Jesus. Amazing. But is it any less amazing that the Lord should choose sinners like you and me? Is it? Causing us to hear about his mighty deeds in the death and resurrection of Jesus, giving us the gift of faith, adopting us into his family, giving us his Holy Spirit. No wonder John Newton could say, amazing grace, amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. You see how this non-essential chapter teaches us that God is gracious. And thirdly, and this I suggest would have been the main lesson for Joshua and the people at the time, that God is faithful. Verses 22 to 24. Well, in these verses we read the spies did as Rahab told them, went into the hills, remained 3 days, and then, after their pursuers had returned and found nothing, then the men went back to the Jordan and reported back to Joshua. Now notice, they didn't report about the land being fruitful, which it was, or about the people being numerous, even some of them giants, which they were, or about Jericho being well fortified. The things we might have expected them to report as spies. No. They didn't report on what they had done, because in some ways they made a real mess of things, haven't they? They reported on what had happened to them and what they had concluded. You see it there? Truly, the Lord has given all the land into our hands, and also all the inhabitants of the land melt away because of us. See, they are certain now that the Lord's promise of the land was being fulfilled. Not because any gathered information about the city, no. But rather because God was at work in someone completely unexpected. And through her, he'd confirmed his promise to them. See, the Lord is known in the Bible as a God who makes promises. But promises are only meaningful when they're fulfilled, or when evidence is given of them being fulfilled. And here the Lord is providing evidence that he is keeping his promise. And surely Joshua and the people would have been so encouraged, learning that God is faithful, learning that God can be trusted. Now we might say that they should have been so certain of God's promises without any extra encouragement. And true, the Lord's word is adequate itself. But the problem is not so much that the Lord's promises are not sure, but we need to feel sure of them, don't we? His word should be sufficient to bolster us. But because of the weakness of our faith, he graciously stoops down, and by many signs and evidences and providences, he makes us feel assured of his already sure word. Here's Dale Ralph Davies again. He says, it's something like a husband who sends a card or note through the mail, this is a few years ago obviously, through the mail to his wife, telling her how much she means to him. She shouldn't need that to know that he loves her. But it's an extra effort that makes her feel loved and appreciated. So the Lord understands our needs. Isn't that lovely? It's as if the Lord is saying to Joshua and his people, Joshua, I am giving you the land I promised. You can trust me. I am faithful. Thinking of your move to this new place, I understand that you've already had signs that the Lord is taking you there, and that his promise to build his church will be fulfilled. Yes, we can stand on the promises of God because he is faithful. So, an unnecessary chapter? Yes. But we're given here these three wonderful truths about the Lord, the God in heaven above and on the earth beneath, our God. He is sovereign. He is in charge of all the circumstances of our lives, even when we think everything is going wrong. He is gracious, causing even the most unlikely people to hear about his mighty deeds, in opening our eyes to acknowledge him as the only true God, in giving us saving faith, in enabling us to commit our lives to him, in bringing us into Christ. What grace. And he is faithful in not only making promises and keeping them, but so often giving us signs and evidences that he is keeping them. What an amazing God we have, don't we? I'm so glad I'm a Christian and have this God as my God. Let's pray together. Our great God and our Father, thank you for your true word, reminding us again tonight that you are sovereign, in charge of all the circumstances of our lives, at work sometimes in mysterious ways for the good of your children. Your word reminding us that you are gracious in using someone like Rahab, creating faith in her, bringing her to acknowledge you as the one true God and her God, and bringing her right into your family. And Lord, you've been so gracious to each one of us in bringing us into Christ. And your word reminding us that you are faithful. You always keep your promises, and so often give us reassurances of those promises. Oh, what a wonderful God you are. We praise you. We delight afresh in these aspects of your unchanging character. And we want to rest in you this week. We commit ourselves to you. We pray in Jesus, our Savior's name. Amen.